Welcome to this video where today I'll be taking you through how I managed to achieve 12 grade 9s in my GCSEs and how you can too. So here is my candidate statement of results for year 11. As you can see, there's only 10 GCSEs here, and that's because I also took a GCSE in year 10 and another one in year 9. For a bit more proof, here's an article from my school's website featuring me with hair that's way too long, but yeah, here you go. So this video is going to be split into three main sections. Firstly, I'm going to talk about time and the quantity and sustainability of your revision. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about the quality of your revision, do's and don'ts, and how to get the most out of the time you spend revising. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking about utilising both lesson and teacher time, so you can actually get the most out of your time in school when in year 11. So first, let's talk about time. I'm going to split this section down into two further subsections, when first I talk about the amount of time you spend revising, and second I talk about the consistency of your revision. So it's probably pretty obvious that the amount of time you spend revising is probably going to correlate with what you get from your revision. For example, two students of equal intelligence, if student 1 spends 10 hours revising and student 2 spends 1 hour revising, it's much more likely that student 1 is going to perform better in their exams. So to optimise and maximise the amount of time you spend revising, my biggest piece of advice here would just be to start as early as possible. So for me, I started revision as soon as I started year 11. Because for year 9 and 10 I spent a lot of time already doing my courses, and I've done a little bit of revision in them years, but not too much. Year 11 I could really start, and I already had a lot of content under my belt I could start to revise from. I would also recommend progressively increasing the amount of time you spend revising as the year goes on. So obviously as soon as you start year 11, you shouldn't really be doing 4 hours a night. If you can sustain that for a prolonged period of time, then great, but the majority of us cannot do that. So for me, I only really started about 1 hour per night as I started year 11. I then increased that to 2 hours per night after Christmas and up to about 3 hours per night from February onwards. However, it's important that you know your limits when you're revising. If you do too much too early, you're going to suffer from burnout, and that means that ultimately your results aren't going to reflect the amount of time you put in. So make sure the amount of time you spend revising is actually sustainable over a long period of time. I'm now going to talk about the consistency of your revision. Numerous studies have been done to show that consistently revising is much better than doing a lump sum. For example, if student 1 revises 4 hours per week for 4 weeks, but student 2 revises 20 hours a week, all in the first week, then student 1 is much more likely to perform better in their final exam because of this consistency over a prolonged period of time. So how does one stay consistent though? Well, what I recommend is trying to prevent your revision from looking as blocky as possible. What I mean is trying to prevent it being, okay, this week I'm doing physics, or this week I'm doing maths. Instead, try and split it up. So maybe tonight I'll do a bit of physics and a bit of maths, tomorrow I'll do a bit of history and a bit of English. That way you can keep consistent and you are able to revisit stuff more frequently and therefore get more from it. So both the amount of time you spend revising and the consistency of your revision are going to go hand in hand in determining the output you get from your revision. Secondly, let's talk about the quality and productivity of your revision. So obviously considering time is really important when looking at your revision, but you also really should be focusing on the quality of your revision. So a couple of my really strong don'ts that you shouldn't be doing when revising is rereading notes, highlighting notes, condensing notes, stuff like this. They have been shown to not be that effective when it comes to what you get from it. Instead, I would recommend these 3 key pointers. First, utilise active recall. Second, do exam practice as much as possible. And third, focus on your weaknesses. So what do I mean when I say active recall? Well, active recall is when you're actively stimulating your memory to recall pieces of information, and it strays away from the traditional passive method of revision. So how can you utilise active recall in your revision? Well, the main way to do this is through flashcards and questions. So when I was revising for my GCSEs, I had piles and piles of revision cards that I used. However, I wouldn't actually recommend this method. Instead, I'd recommend using an online site for your revision cards. Sites such as Brainscape and Anki are really good for this. And I'm currently using Brainscape for my A-level revision. So what you should do when making these revision cards is have a question on one side and an answer on the other side. That way when you see the question, you're going to be stimulating your memory to try and pick out the answer and what information you need to know for this question. You then flip it over, see how well you did, and what I'd recommend is maybe having 2 or 3 piles. The ones you answered perfectly, the ones you did okay on, and the ones you did not know at all. And that way you're going to go over the ones you did not know at all, the most, the ones you kind of knew, the second most, and the ones you were really confident on, the least. That way you can be as productive as possible when revising. Secondly, let's look at exam practice. Exam practice is pretty self-explanatory. It's doing questions that are likely to come up in the actual exam. and this is mainly through the use of past exam questions or textbook questions. Some websites that I'd really recommend to do this are Physics and Maths Tutor and Maths Genie. So what you should really be trying to do is answer these questions in timed and exam-like conditions. So for example, doing a whole past paper, which may be like an hour and a half, would be a really effective method of revision. Then after you've done the past paper, what I'd recommend is going over it and marking it. This way you can kind of see where you're working at, which is a helpful indicator, but more importantly, you can see where your key strengths and weaknesses are. Which leads me nicely on to point number 3, which is focus on these weaknesses. So by using revision cards and having a confidence rating, and by doing exam practices and seeing when you're dropping the majority of your marks, these 2 ways can help you see where your key weaknesses are. And these are the things you should really be focusing on. So for me, for GCSEs, I didn't do any revision for GCSE maths other than the homeworks that I was set, because this was quite a key strength for me, so I didn't really need to be revising this. Instead, I was spending more time on the humanities subject that I wasn't as good at, such as sociology and history. By focusing on these weaknesses, it allowed me to do better in these subjects, because if I just did maths, well, I knew I was going to get a 9 anyway, so by doing maths revision, it's not really going to help me, it's not going to push on my grade. However, with history and sociology, I wasn't entirely sure what grade I was going to get, so by prioritising these subjects, it allowed me to do better in them, and overall, for all my GCSEs, I achieved a higher average grade this way. So I'd really recommend trying to use these 3 methods when revising, and these will really improve the quality of your revision. So active recall, exam practices, and focusing on your weaknesses are the most efficient and effective ways to revise, in my opinion. I should note that these first 2 points about the time and the quality of your revision really go hand in hand in determining what you get from your revision. For example, if one person has really productive and efficient methods of revision, but they're not spending that much time revising and are very inconsistent, then they are not going to maximise what they could get from revision. Similarly, if another person is revising for a very long period of time and they're really consistent, but they've got inefficient methods, they're rereading notes, they're highlighting, again, they're not going to get the most from their revision. To really get the most, you want to be consistent and be spending a good amount of time revising, but also ensuring that you're using these efficient and productive methods. The output of your revision really does depend directly on these 2 points. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking to you about how to utilise both teacher and lesson time. First, let's talk about utilising lesson time. If you're someone who doesn't really pay attention in lessons and you're not really engaging, then theoretically, you could be losing 25 hours of learning per week. Which means that when it comes around to consolidating and revising, you're going to be, theoretically, 25 hours behind other students. And it's up to you to have to make up for that deficit. However, if you are actively engaging, if you're thinking about topics, if you're questioning it, if you have your hand up, then this theoretically could put you 25 hours ahead of other students. Which means that when it comes around to revising, you already have that base knowledge and that base understanding, so you can focus more time on exam practice and things like that, which will really benefit you. So I'd really recommend, especially in year 11, trying to utilise that lesson time as much as possible. Put your hand up, answer questions, ask questions. Really try and get the most out of them lessons, because in the long run, that's really going to help you. You need to remember that doing well in your GCSEs doesn't solely depend on your revision. It depends on what you do in them lessons and what you do in school. Secondly, let's talk about teach time. Believe it or not, your teachers want you to do the best you can in your GCSEs. So if you have any questions or queries, don't be afraid to email them or go to them at lunchtime and break time to ask them. They'll be happy to help, and these people are really confident and should be fascinated by their subject, so of course they want to help you. They're a great resource that you should try and utilise as much as possible. In addition to this, I'd really recommend trying to go to revision clubs or revision sessions during or after school. I went to loads of these in year 11. And they're quite a different vibe from lessons. The people going there are the people that want to revise. So the teachers are really helpful and you'll really get quite a lot from these. But before I end this video, I kind of want to make another point, which is about exams are not the be all and end all. Don't focus all your time in year 11 on exams. Please ensure that you're still doing stuff like getting exercise, having a good diet, meeting up with friends, getting good sleep. These things ultimately are much more important than what you get in your exams. It's really important that you prioritise your health and well-being over your exams. I really hope you found this video helpful and informative. If you have any questions, please leave them down below in the comments and I'll be happy to answer them. Also, it's probably worth me saying that I'll be making another video in the near future about using active recall and exam practice when revising, so look out for that. Thank you very much for watching and I will see you next week.